Chapter 1: A Spark in the Lecture Hall. The lecture hall buzzed with the usual chaos of the first day of classes, papers rustling, students whispering, phones lighting up under desks. Clara Hayes sat near the middle row, her notebook open, pen poised. Her heart raced, not from nerves about her creative writing course, but from knowing who would walk through that door. Professor Julian Thorne. The name alone made her chest tighten. His books had been her companions on sleepless nights, his words the standard she strived to meet in her own writing. She'd imagined this moment countless times, but nothing could prepare her for the reality of him. The door swung open, and there he was. Tall, lean, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt rolled up at the sleeves. His presence commanded the room without effort, the murmurs fading as his gaze swept across the hall. Steel-gray eyes locked briefly with Clara's, and her breath hitched.
Good morning. I'm Professor Thorne. Welcome to Creative Writing 101. Let's cut the fluff. This class isn't about writing what you know. It's about writing what terrifies you, what moves you, what makes you human.
The word settled into her, thrilling and unnerving her all at once. As the lecture progressed, Clara's focus wavered. His critiques were sharp but fair, his insights profound. She scribbled furiously, but it wasn't just the lesson she was taking in, it was the way his hand curled around the marker, the faint smirk when a student answered cleverly, the way his voice softened when discussing vulnerability in prose. When class ended, Clara lingered, pretending to pack her things as the room emptied.
Miss Hayes, was it?
His voice startled her, and she looked up to find him standing closer than she expected.
Yes. Clara Hayes.
She replied, her cheeks flushing.
You have a talent for vivid imagery, he said, his gaze holding hers. But you're holding back. Don't.
Her heart thudded as she nodded, unable to form a coherent reply.
Good. See you Wednesday.
As he walked away, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that he saw something in her she wasn't ready to admit, even to herself. Chapter 2: After Hours. Clara spent the next 2 days revising her first writing assignment, erasing and rewriting until her hand ached. Don't hold back. His words rang in her mind like a mantra, urging her to strip her prose bare, to risk exposure. By Wednesday, she was a bundle of nerves. When she submitted her story at the start of class, her fingers brushed his as he took the pages. The contact was brief, but the spark lingered. Class passed in a blur, but the weight of his presence never left her. When it ended, Clara headed for the door, only to hear her name again.
Miss Hayes, a word.
She froze, turning slowly. A few students cast curious glances as they exited, but soon the room was empty. He stood at his desk, her story in hand.
This is a marked improvement,
he said, tapping the pages. Her chest swelled with pride, but he wasn't finished.
But there's something unresolved here. You're circling something raw, something personal, but you're not confronting it. Why?
Clara hesitated, the words caught in her throat. How could she explain the fear of laying herself bare? Of being truly seen?
It's complicated.
His gaze softened, a flicker of understanding crossing his features.
The best writing often is complicated, messy, honest. Don't let fear censor you, Clara. Perhaps it's easier to untangle in conversation. My office hours are posted, should you wish to discuss your work further.
Her heart skipped. Was that an invitation? Or was she imagining it?
Thank you, Professor Thorne,
she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. He gave her a small, enigmatic smile.
See you next week, Miss Hayes.
As she left the lecture hall, Clara knew one thing for certain. Julian Thorne wasn't just challenging her as a writer, he was unearthing pieces of herself she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Chapter 3: Lines Crossed. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a thin line. The following days were a blur of writing, revisions, and stolen moments of daydreams about Professor Thorne. She found herself analyzing his every word, replaying their conversations over and over. It wasn't until the next week, during office hours, that the air between them thickened into something more. She knocked softly on the door of his office, suddenly unsure of her decision to come. She had been avoiding it, but the lure of his challenge, to open herself up, to confront what she'd been hiding even from her own writing, was too great. Clara heard her professor say come in, and the moment she stepped through the door, Clara felt it, the shift in the atmosphere. His office was dimly lit, the shelves lined with books, some tattered from years of use, others pristine. The faint scent of coffee lingered, and his desk was cluttered with papers. They exchanged a few pleasantries about her story, but Clara could feel the tension building, an electric charge between them. As the conversation shifted to her writing's deeper themes, she found herself speaking more freely than she expected.
I've been avoiding something in my writing. I've never written anything that feels real. That is raw.
She confessed, her voice a little too quiet. He nodded, leaning forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers.
It's often the hardest thing to do, putting yourself on the page. But that's where the power lies. The authenticity.
I'm scared. Scared of what people will think, scared of how it'll feel if they know too much.
Clara's breath caught, and before she could stop herself, the words spilled out. His gaze softened, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, as if they were alone in a world of their own. He stood and walked toward the window, the light casting shadows over his features.
I understand that fear. But hiding behind what's comfortable won't make you a better writer. It'll just keep you stuck.
Clara felt the air grow thicker as he turned back toward her. There was something in his expression, something vulnerable, something that suggested he, too, was speaking from experience. And then, for a split second, his eyes flickered down to her lips before he quickly looked away, as if realizing he had crossed a line. Her pulse quickened.
Professor.
He cleared his throat.
I'm sorry, Clara. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable.
No, it's not that.
She replied, her voice trembling. Before she could finish, the tension in the room snapped. A soft knock at the door interrupted them, and Clara quickly stood, her heart racing.
Come in.
The door opened, and a student entered, breaking the fragile moment. Clara forced a smile, nodded politely, and left the office as quickly as she could, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she wasn't ready to confront. But as she walked down the hallway, she knew one thing for certain: the line between student and teacher was becoming harder to see. Chapter 4, Unspoken Desires. The following week, Clara found it harder and harder to focus in class. Professor Thorne's mere presence was enough to make her heart race, to make the words on the page seem distant and irrelevant. She sat in the back row, her eyes following him as he lectured, every word of his deep voice sinking into her like an intoxicating melody. She could still feel the weight of his gaze during that office visit. The unspoken connection. The way he had looked at her, not just as a student, but as something more. Her mind kept returning to that brief moment when he had stood so close to her, his eyes flickering to her lips before he quickly turned away. What did it mean? When class ended, Clara hesitated before gathering her things. She knew she should leave quickly, should avoid lingering in his orbit any longer, but something pulled her back. Professor Thorne was still at the front of the room, speaking with another student, but his gaze briefly flickered toward Clara. She froze. For a moment, their eyes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between them. She didn't wait to see if he'd approach. Clara slipped out of the lecture hall and walked briskly down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. But before she could escape to the safety of the library, her phone buzzed.
Can we talk after class today?
From Professor Thorne, her stomach flipped. It was the first time he had initiated contact outside of the classroom, and it sent a surge of both excitement and apprehension through her. She didn't reply immediately, her fingers hovering over the screen. What did he want? After a few moments of contemplation, Clara typed.
Yes. I'll be there.
Later that afternoon, Clara made her way to his office once more, her nerves amplified by the uncertainty of what was about to unfold. She knocked softly, and when he called for her to enter, she found him sitting at his desk, looking more serious than usual. His expression was unreadable, but the air between them felt thick, charged, as if something was on the verge of breaking through.
Clara, thank you for coming.
Her breath caught as she closed the door behind her.
I wanted to talk about your recent assignment.
He began, his eyes scanning the pages of her work before he set it down.
It's improving, but I still feel like you're holding something back.
She nodded slowly, unsure how to respond, her pulse racing.
I can't.
She stopped herself, the words caught in her throat. She had started to speak from the heart, but it felt like stepping off a cliff.
I don't know how to let it go. Let myself be vulnerable.
Professor Thorne leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. He was close now, so close that Clara could feel the heat radiating from him.
I understand. Writing, true writing, requires a willingness to expose yourself. But that fear is natural. I know that fear all too well.
His voice had softened, and Clara noticed the faintest tremor in his hand as he reached for her story again. It wasn't a gesture of authority anymore. She felt her breath hitch, and for the briefest moment, their eyes locked again. The connection was undeniable, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. Clara swallowed hard.
Professor,
Before she could finish, he stood up, taking a step closer. He was so close now that she could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint trace of his cologne. She looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest.
I don't want you to be afraid, but sometimes, in order to write the truth, you need to face it. And sometimes facing it means accepting it, no matter how painful it is.
Clara's breath caught as she felt the words resonate within her, but it wasn't just the writing she was thinking of. Her mind raced with the implications of what was unfolding between them. Could they cross this line without consequences?
Professor,
She murmured, her voice trembling. His gaze flickered to her lips again. She could feel the tension building, like a storm on the horizon. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: the moment was upon them. Chapter 5: Unraveling Boundaries. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, as Clara felt her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Her body was trembling, whether from nerves, anticipation, or something else, she couldn't say. All she knew was that Professor Thorne was standing so close now, his presence consuming her, leaving her with little room to think. Professor Thorne's tone shifted, becoming softer and more intimate, as he addressed Clara's potential and the fear that held her back. Though his words were directed at her writing, they carried a deeper meaning that resonated beyond the surface. Clara's thoughts tangled with the weight of the moment, her instincts urging her to step away even as her body betrayed her, drawing her closer. She struggled to articulate her feelings, gesturing between them in silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tension. Thorne moved closer, his expression gentler now, his hand brushing against hers in a fleeting touch that sent a spark through her. His presence was overwhelming yet reassuring, and his words carried the weight of someone who understood the beauty in embracing the complicated. For Clara, time seemed to stop as she stood before him, her heart racing. In that moment, he wasn't merely her professor or her mentor. He was the only person who truly saw her, not just the writer, but the woman beneath. And the way he looked at her now. It was as if he saw everything she had tried to hide, everything she had buried deep within her.
I shouldn't, but I can't help myself. I want to.
He murmured, stepping even closer, his breath warm on her skin. His fingers grazed her jaw, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. Clara's body seemed to move on its own. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and she felt a magnetic pull toward him, something she had tried to ignore but could no longer deny.
Professor, I don't want to be afraid anymore.
She whispered, her voice barely audible, and in that instant, everything changed. He leaned down, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, as if testing the waters. Clara's breath caught as she melted into it, her mind spinning, but her heart finding an unexpected sense of belonging in the moment. His lips were soft, but there was a hunger there, something urgent, raw. When they finally pulled away, Clara's pulse was racing. Her lips tingled from the kiss, and she could feel the heat of his hands on her arms, his gaze intense, searching.
Clara, are you sure about this?
He said, his voice hoarse. Her thoughts were clouded, but she nodded, her eyes never leaving his. She was sure. She had never been more sure of anything in her life. She replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her.
I'm sure.
He sighed, a mixture of relief and uncertainty in his expression. For a moment, they simply stood there, the space between them charged with the consequences of what they had just crossed.
This is dangerous. You're my student. I'm your professor. There are risks.
I know. But some things are worth the risk.
She whispered, taking a step closer. He looked at her for a long moment, as if searching for any trace of doubt in her eyes. But when he found none, he pulled her back to him, kissing her again, this time with more urgency, more need. As their kiss deepened, the world outside the office seemed to vanish. In that moment, there was no professor, no student, only two people who had crossed an invisible line they couldn't turn back from. Chapter 6. Unraveled Secrets. For the next few weeks, Clara and Professor Thorne continued their secret meetings in his office, each encounter more intense than the last. There was a dangerous thrill in their secrecy, a heat that crackled in the air between them every time they stole a moment alone. Every touch, every kiss, felt like a defiance of everything they knew they shouldn't be doing. It started innocently enough, a lingering conversation about her writing that turned into whispered confessions, which turned into touches that lingered longer than they should. Their conversations blurred with stolen glances, their eyes speaking the words they couldn't voice out loud. Clara found herself arriving early to class, lingering in the hallways, waiting for him to call her to his office after hours. They had learned to speak in half sentences, their words trailing off as their hands found each other in the quiet solitude of his space. His office became a haven for them, a place where they could be more than just student and professor. And the intimacy, when it came, was intoxicating. Each touch was like a drug she couldn't resist. The first time his hand had wandered down her back, pulling her closer, she felt her entire body ignite with desire. He was careful, never too much, never too fast, but each time their lips met, the fire between them grew. There were nights when they lost track of time, their bodies entangled on his couch, the dim light from his desk lamp casting shadows across their skin. She felt him against her, the heat of his body seeping into her, and she responded with equal urgency. Each time he touched her, it was as if he was unlocking a part of her she hadn't known existed, a side of herself that was free, unburdened by fear. But as much as she tried to ignore it, the fear lingered. They were breaking every rule, defying every boundary. And Clara knew that sooner or later, someone would notice. One day, it happened. Clara had arrived early that afternoon, just as Professor Thorne was finishing up a meeting with a colleague. They exchanged a brief glance, one filled with quiet, unspoken promises. He had closed the door behind him as they slipped inside, the world outside disappearing the moment the lock clicked. They didn't speak much that day. There was no need. Their lips met the moment the door closed, their hunger for each other urgent. He pushed her gently against the wall, his mouth crashing against hers, while his hands moved to unbutton her blouse. Clara responded with equal fervor, her hands tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer, her heart pounding in her chest. His kisses grew more frantic, more insistent, as though he couldn't stop himself. Her hand slid down his chest, over the firm muscles she had come to know so well. She knew this wasn't just physical, it was a desperate need to be with him, a longing they had both tried to ignore, but which was now consuming them entirely. As he gently pushed her onto the desk, Clara's mind swirled with desire. She had done this before, and yet every touch still made her feel as if it was the first time, as if they were both on the edge of something they couldn't pull back from. Her legs wrapped around him instinctively, and for a moment, they were lost in each other. But then the door opened. The creak of the door was barely audible, but it was enough. Clara's heart stopped. She pulled away, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with shock.
Professor Thorne. Oh,
The voice was unmistakable. Another student. The door had swung open just wide enough to reveal them, Professor Thorne and Clara, half-dressed, caught in the act. Time seemed to slow as Clara's pulse raced. Her mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, but none of them could prepare her for the reality of being exposed. She scrambled to adjust her clothes, but the damage had already been done. Professor Thorne stood frozen, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief, as he quickly moved to shield Clara from view. His face flushed with the realization of what had just happened.
I didn't know to. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
The student stammered, their eyes wide with shock. The student's voice trailed off as they hastily backed out, closing the door behind them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara's chest heaved as she tried to process what had just happened. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she had never imagined.
Clara, we need to figure this out.
Thorne's voice was tight, the weight of the situation settling over him. Her mind raced, but she couldn't find the words. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to make sense of the mess they had made, but she couldn't move. Professor Thorne moved toward her, his expression pained, his fingers reaching for her, but she instinctively took a step back. She was shaking, more from the shock than from anything else.
I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen.
She whispered, her voice trembling. He ran a hand through his hair, his face filled with regret.
Neither did I, Clara. Neither did I.
The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. They were both at a crossroads, unsure of what would come next. Would they be able to keep this secret? Could they even continue this forbidden relationship? Clara met his gaze, her heart still racing, but her mind in chaos. She didn't know where they went from here. She didn't know if they could fix this. The door opened again. This time, it was locked. They were alone, just the two of them. But for how long?
And that concludes the end of this audiobook. Please like, share, and subscribe for more, and see you on my next free audiobook.